Back in 2016, during the Paris climate talks, world leaders commissioned the IPCC to do a meta-analysis on climate change, and 2 years later, we're finally seeing their findings. And they're devastating, to say the least. So according to Jonathan Watts of The Guardian, the world's leading climate scientists have warned there is only a dozen years for global warming to be kept to a maximum of 1.5 degrees Celsius, beyond which even half a degree will significantly worsen the risks of drought, floods, extreme heat, and poverty for hundreds of millions of people. The authors of the landmark report by the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released on Monday say urgent and unprecedented changes are needed to reach the target, which they say is affordable and feasible, although it lies at the most ambitious end of the Paris Agreement pledge to keep temperatures between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. The half-degree difference could also prevent corals from being completely eradicated and ease pressure on the Arctic, according to the study, which was launched after approval at a final plenary of all 195 countries in Incheon in South Korea that saw delegates hugging one another, with some in tears. The world is currently 1 degree Celsius warmer than pre-industrial levels, following devastating hurricanes in the United States, record droughts in Cape Town, and forest fires in the Arctic. The IPCC makes clear that climate change is already happening, upgraded its risk warning from previous reports, and warned that every fraction of additional warming would worsen the impact. At 1.5 degrees Celsius, the proportion of the global population exposed to water stress could be 50% lower than at 2 degrees Celsius, and notes food scarcity would be less of a problem and hundreds of millions fewer people, particularly in poor communities, would be at risk of climate-related poverty. At 2 degrees Celsius, extremely hot days, such as those experienced in the northern hemisphere this summer, would become more severe and common, increasing heat-related deaths and causing more forest fires. But the greatest difference would be to nature. Insects, which are vital for pollination of crops and plants, are almost twice as likely to lose half their habitat at 2 degrees Celsius compared to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Corals would be 99% lost at the higher of the two temperatures, but more than 10% have a chance of surviving if the lower target is reached. Carbon pollution would have to be cut by 45% by 2030, compared with a 20% cut under the 2 degrees Celsius pathway, and come down to zero by 2050, compared with 2075 for 2 degrees Celsius. This would require carbon prices that are 3 to 4 times higher than for a 2 degrees Celsius target. But the costs of doing nothing would be far higher. So, reading this report sent chills down my spine. This is utterly terrifying. We've got 12 years to get our act together. Will we do it? Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like that's going to be the case because look, during the Paris Climate Accords, most countries came together. And even if the Paris Climate Agreement did not go far enough, it still was a step in the right direction. But now we're seeing the emergence of right-wing populism and right-wing demagogues across the world like Donald Trump, who are choosing, unilaterally so, to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord. And now, far-right lunatic Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil is poised to become the next president, and if he's elected, like Trump, he pledges also to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement, and he also has pledged to open up the Amazon rainforest in Brazil to big business at a time when we desperately need to be moving towards reforestation and not deforestation as quickly as possible. So by and large, inhabitants of the world chose a hell of a time to start falling for absolute loony right-wing demagogues like Donald Trump and Jair Bolsonaro. And I don't want to draw, too much of a comparison between Trump and Bolsonaro, because I think that Bolsonaro is more akin to someone like Duterte, according to Glenn Greenwald, who lives in Brazil, because he just would be essentially a dictator. He states that he wants to do extrajudicial killings in Brazil in order to end the country's unrest. So someone like him, I mean, it wouldn't just be a disaster for Brazil, it would be a disaster for the world. And he's still facing off against Fernando Haddad, who's more akin to Lula and part of the Workers' Party, but if Bolsonaro wins, like Donald Trump, he's going to pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement. So we've got the United States pulling out, and Jair Bolsonaro potentially doing the same in Brazil if he wins, which I hope he doesn't, but seems like that's going to be the case. So at a time when we need to be doing everything we can to make progress, and we have 12 years left, everyone around the world is falling for right-wing demagogues. And part of it is due to justifiable rage against the establishment who's not representing them. So it's not just the people, it's the establishment who failed the people in all these countries. But I mean, this all came at the worst time possible. This literally could be the beginning of the end of humanity, and certainly if humanity is somehow able to survive the worst of what climate change has to offer, the world will never be the same. So I honestly don't know what to say about this. I don't. It's really, really depressing. People born today, I can't even imagine what their golden years, so-called golden years, will be like because of climate change. And as you could tell, I'm not too optimistic that the world will come together and act by 2030. Corporations, they account for 71% of the world's carbon emissions. So, of course, we all have to take matters into our own hands, but even if each citizen does everything they possibly can, we all stop eating meat and fight against factory farming, we stop driving and we rely on public transport, it's still not enough. Corporations are polluting, and the one force that actually can take on corporations is governments around the world. But they're just not willing to do that. So this is really, really depressing. We have a right-wing majority on the Supreme Court that's very solid. So if we get a Democratic president like Bernie Sanders and he passes climate change reform, the court can strike it down. So it's not only that we're not doing anything, we're choosing to not act. Even if we somehow muster the political courage to act, well, our hands are tied. We are fucked as a species.
Support this podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Humanist Report.